Joining us now, we have New York Times opinion columnist David French, New York Times reporter and MSNBC contributor Jeremy Peters, and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. All right, so welcome to you all. Lisa, you first here. Is the Trump administration within its right to ask federal agencies to do this even? Are there any legal protections in place that they can come up against them and say, point to that, implement that?
Absolutely. I mean, let's start with the fact, Alex, that contracts are themselves legal documents that have terms. So you can't just go to agencies and say, it's the policy of this administration to terminate contracts with Harvard University across the board. You have to actually look at the language of each contract and see, are there grounds for termination of each and every individual contract? You might also be able to say to them, in the future, let's not contract with Harvard. But of course, that would bump up against its own anti-discrimination obligations under the First Amendment, because what Harvard has said is you are retaliating against us for exercising our First Amendment rights. And that's itself a constitutional violation. So I don't think the letter that NBC News has obtained from the General Services Administration is necessarily going to withstand court scrutiny. But let's see how this plays out in the details.
So, Jeremy, that soundbite you heard, the thing that is trying to be stripped from Harvard, Alan Garber talks about its research funding, its initiatives, things that the government wants and needs. So put this all together. I mean, how does it make any sense? And does he have a point that can be played in court and challenge the Trump administration on this?
Well, Alex, it's always been the case since the Trump administration started threatening the funding of these universities that they've been acting outside the bounds of the law and the First Amendment.
There's the norms.
And the norms. Yeah. Well, and if you want to take it even further, this notion that Trump has really pushed and believed in and espoused, which is that America is an exceptional country. Some of the most exceptional research, from the development of the atomic bomb to sequencing of the human genome, has come out of American research universities and funded by the federal government. But, you know, to back up just a bit there, there's a process that the government has to go through if it wants to cancel federal funding to universities. It has to give them a certain amount of notice. It has to explain why. It's largely not done that in any of these cases. Furthermore, it's outside the bounds of the law to target specific actors because of simply who they are, what they're saying, what they've been doing. And in this case, it's very hard for the Trump administration to argue that it is not persecuting Harvard simply because it's Harvard. And we know this not just from what, you know, the administration's many actions targeting their foreign students, targeting their research grants, targeting other types of contracts, targeting them over their DEI policies, their curriculum, saying that they want to audit the faculty and the incoming student body for their political and ideological bents. You know, all this stuff they're targeting Harvard for a very specific reason, and that's because it is seen by many as the crown jewel of American higher education. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good, sound legal argument that they'll be able to make in court to do this. Just because they can do it doesn't necessarily mean that's a good reason.
Which brings me to you, David, because I know you certainly have thoughts. Even if these cases that Donald Trump is firing off amount to nothing, you say it is still inflicting immense harm on our universities. Explain that.
Yeah. So basically what happens is the administration gets its way for a time until a court intervenes. Then when the court intervenes, it presses pause for a moment, and then the administration is switching tactics and trying another way of attacking Harvard and gets its way for a while until the court intervenes. And you can do this rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And that creates an enormous amount of uncertainty at Harvard. It creates financial uncertainty. It creates admissions uncertainty for foreign students, for example. So what students, if they're a choice between a Harvard where they may be kicked out in 3 months, kicked out, detained and kicked out of the country, or going to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge in the United Kingdom where they know they'll be welcome. So what is happening here is a voluntary brain drain. It's a voluntary attack on America's scientific and intellectual community in a way that will ultimately harm this nation a great deal. But you can win in court. The important point here is you can win in court, and I applaud Harvard for standing up. I applaud Harvard for not bending the knee. This legal response is necessary, but the legal response doesn't necessarily end the threat to Harvard, because Trump will try another thing and then another thing and another thing, which requires constant legal intervention.
Meaning another thing, another thing, another thing, Jeremy, it's not going to stop at Harvard. Do other academic institutions, like a domino effect, they're all watching this very carefully, thinking we could be next?
Well, and the Trump administration has already published a list of dozens of universities it says it could go after. And that ranges from everything because the administration has a problem with the way that they've pursued DEI policies to their, in some cases, failure to take action in anti-Semitic activity on campus. One thing that Harvard has done that is interesting and is different from what, say, Columbia did when it was targeted by the Trump administration is express a lot of humility in saying, we didn't get everything right here. We know that we have a problem.
Stuff to work on.
Yes. Yeah. And Alan Garber, my colleague Gina Kolata sat down and interviewed him for a profile that the two of us wrote on Alan Garber and his challenges at Harvard. And he was very upfront and said, look, I know Harvard has a lot of work to do here. We have problems that we need to fix, and we are willing to do that. Well, that didn't get him anything with the Trump administration. So I think that says, and Lisa would know better than I would, maybe this goes a way toward making Harvard's legal case, that you're not dealing with good faith actors here. The Trump administration seems hell-bent on punishing Harvard because it's Harvard, and it will stop at nothing until it gets its pound of flesh.
Can you pick up on that, Lisa? I mean, how is it that they say this is all at the root of it is an anti-Semitism, correct? That they seem to have displayed on campus. I will say Alan Garber, he is Jewish, the president of the university. If they're not stopping at anything and they think of different things to add to it, how does that play in a court?
Well, I think each court is going to look at the facts before it in terms of the specific funding source that's being terminated or the policy at issue, for example, Harvard's ability to enroll foreign students. But the aggregate impact of the escalation campaign, I can see that in my mind's eye, in an opinion, playing a role in courts' decision-making factors, meaning you didn't give Harvard an opportunity to remedy its own behavior when they came to the negotiating table or even told you, for example, in the letter before the initial suit, the suit after they alleged a Title VI violation. They said, our door is always open. We remain willing and able to talk with you. And then the next thing they knew, the Trump administration said, we're going to cut off all funding. That will be meaningful to a judge. And certainly the fact that Alan Garber has, as Jeremy said, been humble, but also has transparently talked about his own victimization here. Alan Garber is Jewish. He has talked about the ways in which caricatures of him have been drawn on campus. And the fact that he is now defending Harvard puts him in a unique position to say, I see the problem because I have suffered the problem. We are not unique here among other universities. What makes them unique, though, is their ability to withstand the pressure. At $53+ billion, it is the largest endowment in American higher education, and that allows Harvard a certain luxury that other institutions downstream simply won't have or don't have.
True, but it's not like it's just a bank account. I mean, a lot of that money has been allotted. They can't just pull from one to
That's
do
certainly
another.
True, or they can't touch it. But, again, in terms of Harvard's willingness to address some of this itself, another fact that I think about is that President Garber has said, I'll take a 25% pay cut next year because this is going to be pain that's going to be shared throughout the university, and I'm not immune to it. Again, a humility that I think will serve Harvard well in court.
And David, what about the threats to take, $3 billion? I mean, Trump's saying $3 billion in Harvard grant money and then redistribute it to trade schools. I mean, this appears to be a redistribution of money that the administration has already frozen from Harvard and its research partners. So how would that work?
Well, again, this is political retaliation. I mean, look, there are good reasons to fund trade schools, but one of the reasons, one of those good reasons is not to punish other academic institutions. So fund trade schools on their own merit, fund Harvard on its own merit. But there's one thing I think we really need to drill down on. What the administration has done a very good job of selling, at least part of the public on, is this idea that they're holding Harvard accountable for anti-Semitism, that they're the ones taking action to hold Harvard accountable for anti-Semitism. It is very important to note that There are ways to hold Harvard accountable. And in fact, there is a lawsuit working its way through the federal system right now holding Harvard accountable for anti-Semitism on campus after October 7th. But there are specific legal processes for this. It is not simply the case that the administration can decide, well, we saw anti-Semitism in, say, the Middle East Studies Department. Now we're going to defund pediatric cancer research. That's not the way this system works at all. You target the entity or the individuals within the university who are engaging in the problematic behavior. You target the departments, the programs that are engaging in the problematic behavior. There's due process. There's an opportunity to be heard. These are words we've been hearing a lot of lately, due process. That's words that Americans have probably heard more in the last 3 months than they heard in the previous 30 years. But it's a vital American value. And essentially what he's doing is he's doing the old sentence first, verdict afterwards, where he is holding the punishment. He's imposing punishment prior to the trial, and that is directly contradictory to our constitutional principles.
Let me ask you quickly, Lisa, on the international student ban. A federal judge in Boston, as you know, has we'll put a temporary block on that, scheduled a hearing on Thursday. But we're also hearing today that the Trump administration has stopped granting the immigration interviews for visas for foreign students, which means, let's see, it's Tuesday. This is all supposed to be discussed on Thursday in earnest. How's that happening?
I don't know how that's happening, in particular because there are separate litigation that's not Harvard specific, having to do with cancellation of existing student visas and putting a block on that. Like, you can't en masse cancel student visas simply because people are immigrants and you're trying to reduce the number of immigrants in the country. Proactively for the administration to cancel those interviews without reason, I think, Alex, we're going to need to know more about why they're doing it and to whom they're doing it. But to do it indiscriminately across the board doesn't seem like it would cut the legal mustard from where I stand.